Alright, always good when this works. Alright, we're going to continue on with some terms here. Sort of like the deduction, induction, we have descriptivism and prescriptivism. Two opposing ways of representing a given state of affairs. The descriptive approach seeks to impartially classify its object according to the qualities it displays. The prescriptive or normative approach presents its object as a standard against which similar states of affairs can be judged. The distinction is made in rhetoric, so the talking about it, where a statement such as "that's a knife" may simply identify the object or, with different emphasis, indicate its superiority. Now that's a knife. Or insignificant, "that's a knife." In ethics, descriptivism refers to the view that moral values can be derived from purely factual statements, and prescriptivism to the view that moral principles derive from an unquestionable authority. They're talking about David Hume's famous statement of the is versus is/ought problem, disputed the former position, asserting that just because something is a certain way does not imply that it ought to be so. Whereas ethical descriptivism does not necessarily require one to act on a moral judgment, ethical prescriptivism does, often invoking a higher authority such as God or natural law as a justification for its injunctions. Prescriptivism in science treats the word law as imperative rather than predictive. For example, the prescriptive version of the law of gravity decrees that apples must fall downward, whereas the descriptive version, noting that they do fall, predicts that they will do so. In linguistics, so talking about language, the term descriptivism was first applied to the type of analysis pioneered by anthropologists Franz Boas and Edward Sapir in their studies of Native American languages. We've updated that to indigenous, which sought to classify and interpret sounds and meanings without reference to other languages' linguistic conventions. Linguistic prescriptivism holds that there is an absolute standard of correct grammar and syntax that overrides common usage, often dismissing regional and dialectical variations and differences between written and spoken language. Descriptive grammar seeks to document the language as it is actually used, without judging what is correct, and its practitioners are often faulted for perpetuating incorrect usages such as ain't, and for condoning sexist usages such as mankind and the generic he, but not advocating gender-neutral alternatives. So we're going to keep going here. I got a couple more. We don't need that one. There's more in here than I thought. Okay, so determinism. This is going to bring in some stuff in here for some of your science, and then some social studies in with that as well. So it's again some of these branching across a couple different topics. Determinism. The theory arising from a strict interpretation of causation, that every state of affairs is determined by the situation preceding it and constitutes a link in an unalterable chain of events. It is distinct from predestination, the idea that God has preordained world history and human destiny, primarily in viewing the course of events as the result of unconscious physical, social, or behavioral laws, not divine agency. So again, we're talking about cause and effect, and a sort of linear chain of events. The determinist thesis has been primarily applied to physical laws. The universe conceived as a self-perpetuating mechanism driven by an endless sequence of cause and effect. It is most notably associated with the 18th century French mathematician and physicist Pierre-Simon Laplace. Looks like Laplace, but Laplace, who speculated that a sufficient intelligence, knowing the laws of physics and the speed of position of every particle in the universe, would be able to predict its entire future. This proposition, which was current throughout the 19th century, has been undermined by quantum physics, relativity, and chaos theory, all of which postulate that fundamentally indeterminate nature of the universe. Similarly, determinism as a philosophical stance has been challenged by existentialism and phenomenology, which emphasize absolute freedom in an absurd universe. Definitely existentialism we'll get to, so hold that. The determinist model, however, has spawned numerous theories applying the concept to the social sciences. Cultural determinism holds that our interpretation of the world is inescapably rooted in our socio-culture milieu, well, kind of the place where we're at. The term is also used as a synonym for cultural relativism, mostly by critics who feel it seeks to explain differences between people in terms of cultural determinants, to the exclusion of other factors. According to Marx's theory of historical materialism, social conditions are determined by underlying economic forces, and historical progress is determined by the inexorable dialectic process of class conflict. Dialectical, again, we're going to get to that, but it's going between two things. Sometimes the prefix for die is similar to bi, like bicycle has that with two-wheeled, and this is sometimes die is used in that same thing as well. Technological determinism holds that changes in technology cause, or at least propel, social changes. For example, the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century is said to have created the urban capitalism of the 19th century. In psychology, behaviorism interprets human activity as physiological responses to environmental stimuli determined by prior conditioning. Freud's theory of psychic determinism stressed the unconscious causes of mental and physiological processes, diminishing the scope of individual free will. His assertion that women's nature is biologically determined and inherently inferior was assailed by critics such as Karen Horney, whose version of cultural determinism emphasized instead the influence of cultural conditions in psychological development. Horney? Like Horney. So cause and effect, one thing coming before another, and that's determining the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. Again, one of those things you kind of have to be careful. It's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Not everything is always just one specific thing with that. Deterrence. Definitely something that has had a lot of discussion. This is going to be a little bit more towards the larger aspect of deterrence in terms of between countries and so on. But DETERRENCE. For me, that second R always kills me in terms of trying to spell it. Deterrence is generally the prevention of an unwanted action by the threat of an undesirable consequences, particularly a defense policy based on the ability to inflict unacceptable damage on an aggressor. Deterrence was the foundation of the military strategy of both superpowers during most of the Cold War, based on the policy of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, as a result of massive retaliation in kind against any nuclear attack. And boy, what a time that was. To succeed, deterrence must be credible. The party practicing it must be seen as both having the capacity and the willingness to carry out the threat. It also assumes that the adversary is rational and will not intentionally invite disastrous consequences. What in modern deterrence theory is called the credibility problem arises from the question of whether a policy based on mutual destruction can be considered either credible or rational. There it is. Since it depends on the willingness to risk self-annihilation, at the very least. The policy of nuclear deterrence, which the United States adopted in the 1950s after the Soviet Union acquired H-bomb technology, created a functional balance of power, called a balance of terror, between the superpowers. But the notion that nuclear war was unthinkable also led to acts of brinksmanship, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the United States rattled the nuclear saber to force the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. The principle of extended deterrence was also the basis of the NATO and Warsaw Pact alliances, in which the superpowers extended the, quote, nuclear umbrella, end quote, over the allies in Europe, using the nuclear threat to discourage attack by conventional weapon forces. However, some critics argue that the policy aimed at preventing World War III actually encouraged U.S. and Soviet involvement in small conventional wars, directly, as in Vietnam and Afghanistan, and indirectly, as in Ethiopia and Nicaragua, based on the calculation that the other side would not intervene to the extent of risking nuclear confrontation. Yeah, and then we're still, in a lot of ways, dealing with some of the fallout from those things. For example, Osama bin Laden had been trained and armed in the 80s by the United States, because the Soviet Union was getting involved in Afghanistan in one way. Osama bin Laden was on the other side, so we got involved with that and trained and funded and armed them. So there's that. Okay, dialectic. This has come up a couple times. Let's actually sort of define that a little bit more. And then dialectic materialism, because that's also was brought up in this part today here. Sorry, it's early. Dialectic, from the Greek word for discourse, originally the method of philosophical inquiry perfected by Socrates, later developed as a basis of philosophies of Hegel and Marx. In all cases, dialectic works through contradiction. In the Socratic method, a problem or proposition is put to the test through rigorous questioning that whittles away common misconceptions and reveals its contradictions. Dialectic, by the way, D-I-A-L-E-C-T-I-C. So dialectic logic is a three-stage process, usually stated as thesis, antithesis, or antithesis, and synthesis. In this triad, a proposition is presented, countered by its opposite, and ultimately transformed through the interaction of the two in the new superior hybrid. Hegel saw this process as the basis of historical change. He identified dialectic moments or stages of history in which existing concept and institutions develop internal conflicts that are eventually overcome in the creation of a new moment. A commonly cited instance of the dialectic is Hegel's examination of the oppositional, quote, master-slave, end quote, relationship. In this case, the thesis is the master's dominant position is countered by its antithesis of the slave's subjective condition. The relationship is one of conflict, which can be overcome only by a synthesis of the two conditions, a recognition of interdependence. The slave depends upon the master for food and shelter, the master needs the slave for work, and, indeed, for his very identity as master, from which can grow a more equal relationship. That's leaving out the fact that if you still have a slave, there is no equality to that at all. So that's sort of with that. But you know, when was Hegel? German, a while ago. Not ideal in terms of that. Maybe they could have used a better thing for that. Hegel, late 18th, early 19th century, German. Yeah, maybe use a better one for that. Not super great. So, the basic idea in terms of dialectic method is sort of like, I mean, it's almost like a form of alchemy. It's you have this thing that you're being presented with, and through the conversation of kind of going back and forth between, well, it's this, well, what about this, it's this, with it, you get to the real true heart of the matter. You clean off, chip off, whittle away all the other stuff that's on an idea, on a thing, and you save what's left of that, and that would be the more sort of true heart of the matter. So that would be getting to then, yeah, that sort of capital T truth, and you're peeling away a lot of the things that have been conditioned, the sort of the social, cultural, or religious things that have been heaped on that opinion, that A statement, the thesis statement is going to have a lot of stuff that's conditioned on it originally, is the idea. That's going to be because, oh, well, you were brought up in a household that said this, in a city state or a city or a culture that said that, and the religious aspect of this is involved with that. And then also during the time of it, if you were American in, the 19th, born in like maybe the late 20s, and you grew up through the Depression, and maybe just old enough for World War II, maybe just still slightly a little bit too young or something like that, your what you say of, well, this is this of the world is going to be colored by all those things, and that in a very short time is a lot to deal with, and that's going to color certain things with how you do that. So the idea of the dialectic method is that conversation, that back and forth, that's going to whittle away and take away some of those things to get to what the actual truth of the idea or the matter or the feeling or the belief really is. The Hegelian dialectic has had its most influential embodiment in the Marxist analysis. In this view, the dominance of capitalism produces internal contradictions within the economic and social system, as impersonal means of production and over-concentration of wealth lead to the exploitation and alienation of the proletariat. This condition produces class conflict, resulting in the eventual triumph of socialism, the control of capital by workers. Although seeing history as dialectical seems to imply a never-ending sequence of contradiction, conflict, and temporary resolution, both Hegel and Marx envisioned a final perfected condition. For Hegel, an ultimate state of absolute freedom; for Marx, communism, which would arise as socialism gave way through its own internal contradictions. So going into dialectic materialism right into that, the core of Marxist theory, holding that human consciousness derives from material conditions and that history progresses according to dialectical laws. So the idea of human consciousness derives from material conditions seems to sound more like the brain is the generator of consciousness versus a sort of receiver from a larger sort of consciousness that's going to be viewing itself through the consciousness that sort of you are. Marx himself did not use the term. It was employed by his collaborator Friedrich Engels, and the concept is particularly associated with Engels' elaboration of Marxian theory. Dialectical materialism is also known as historical materialism, although the latter term is usually applied more generally to the Marxian theory that history is propelled by technological advances and changes in social and economic organization. Dialectical materialism is an inversion of Hegel's theory of dialectical idealism, from which it is descended. Both Marx and Hegel believe that history advances dialectically, that is, through conflicts within the prevailing order, which are resolved through their synthesis into a new order, which in due course develops its own internal conflicts and eventual resolution, and so on. But whereas Hegel saw human consciousness or spirit as the motive force in history, creating social and material circumstances, Marx believed just the opposite. Consciousness does not determine life, life determines consciousness. He and Engels wrote in the German Ideology, specifically economic circumstances, the relations of production, through which nature is transformed into material goods by human labor, determine social organization, which in turn shapes our ideas, relationships, and identities. The exploitative relations that characterize capitalist production, Marx contended, generate class conflict between workers and owners that will inevitably produce a revolutionary upheaval in which capitalism is replaced by socialism, a synthesis that achieves workers' aspirations to control the fruits of their labor while retaining the structure of the state, which will ultimately wither away under full communism. So that those material things that we're around determine how things are going to be, as opposed to sort of driven more by higher means. So that's the continuing on. Oh boy. You know what? We're going to push through because we're super almost done. We're super almost done with this. All right, let's just push through because I don't want to do another one if we can just knock this out. So it says diminishing returns law of. So the law of diminishing returns. This might be something you might need to know for history, civics sort of thing with that. So that's why I'm using this here. In economics, the principle that as more of one production factor, labor, capital, or land, is added to a production process in which other factors are fixed, the amount of output or product derived from each additional amount of input will eventually begin to fall. Also called the law of diminishing marginal returns, because the decreasing rate of a return of each additional or marginal unit of input used. So the idea that as more of one production factor is added to the production process in which other factors are fixed, the amount or output of product derived from each additional amount of input will begin to fall. So you're going to have, sort of fixed things that you're going to need to have in order to produce. But the more factor that you sort of add in, the sort of less profit you're going to get. So the amount of output or product derived from each additional amount of input will begin to fall. The more you have to put in, the sort of less you kind of get out, sort of thing. The law was first applied to agricultural production, notably in the work of English economist David Ricardo, who observed that as more and more labor and machinery are put to work on a given quantity of land, the rate of output, for example, bushels of harvest per worker, at first rises, but eventually declines as the productive capacity of the land is approached. By the same token, if land is brought under cultivation one field at a time, starting with the most fertile and progressing to the most infertile, as more and more of the land is cultivated, the rate of additional output bushels per acre declines. Adding inputs to production process generally results in an initial increase in productivity because of economies of scale. So the more you put in, the more you're going to get back initially. Two farmlands working together may harvest 100 bushels a day, where one alone can only reap 40. The related principle of returns to scale evaluates the change in output that occurs if all inputs are changed by the same amount. If the inputs are doubled, twice as many workers, machines, raw materials, the firm is said to have constant returns to scale if input doubles, increasing returns to scale if output more than doubles, and decreasing returns to scale if if it less than doubles. Part of that is just for example, the idea of that initial increase. This is where making things entirely too material is problematic. When I worked at Borders the bookstore, we might have one weekend that was like a teacher's appreciation weekend, and then they have like a leap year or something, so the next year we were expected to meet this certain amount of money based on the year before. And then if we kept missing that amount of money, then that would determine people's schedules for like the week after, or the month after, or something like that, because then whatever percentage of budget. But none of those factors from the year before were taken into account. So we had this whole thing, but if things weren't taken into account, and that messed us up like the year afterwards. But so eventually you can't keep producing something at a ridiculous rate all the time. You can't do it. Eventually, the more you put in, the less you're going to get out sometimes. I'm gonna add this one in because I think it's particularly poignant at the moment. So something called double consciousness, a concept of African American identity introduced by W.E.B. Du Bois in the book, assuming it's a book, The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. According to Du Bois, that's D-U-B-O-I-S, because of the effects of racism, black Americans unavoidably perceive themselves in relation to the dominant white culture around them. Their self-perception is filtered through two levels of consciousness. They see themselves not only as human individuals, but also as whites see them, different in color and culture by virtue of their African ancestry, and therefore alien and second class. This fractured consciousness deprives African Americans of a true sense of self, Du Bois suggested, and creates a worldview that is not only false, but harmful, defeating the spirit and thwarting aspirations. Later commentators, however, have proposed that double consciousness may have positive effects as well. Bernard Bell, for example, believes that the resulting conflicts and tensions have given rise to creative as well as destructive impulses, and Nathan Huggins suggests that double consciousness allows African Americans to see the dominant society that much more clearly, and therefore enables them to transcend its assumptions. I think definitely, again, we're on the 11th of June here in 2020, so something that we're talking about and working on, and rather important. Last one, dualism. The position that the world is comprised primarily of two substances, usually mind and matter, or that reality exists in an apparent realm and a true one. Examples of dualistic philosophies include Descartes' division of the universe into physical and the spiritual, and Kant, that's K-A-N-T, but Kant, determination between phenomena and noumena. I haven't had to read that word in a while. Dualism had its earliest expression in the opposition of good and evil that formed the basis of the creation myth of the Zoroastrian religion established around 1000 BCE. The battle between good and evil, God and Satan, appears in many religious traditions. The Manichaean sect, for instance, founded in Persia in the 2nd century CE, saw existence as a struggle between darkness, the evil material world, and light, the spiritual realm, and religious prophets as messengers sent to liberate the light, which is imprisoned in the corrupt matter. That also is very Gnostic, Gnostic, in a lot of things as well. I'll get to that in a second. The clash of good and evil in religious belief provides the paradigm for most dualistic philosophical systems. Dualism implies polarity and conflict, not syncretism. Never the twain shall meet, rather than two heads are better than one. The two sides are usually unbalanced, with one considered superior or more real than the other, as well as more diverse. In Descartes' view, for instance, the realm of mind is more complex and subtle than that of matter. The traditional objection to dualism, that two sorts of reality of entirely different orders should not be able to communicate with or act on each other, has spawned a variety of responses. Aristotle proposed that form and matter unite in substance. Occasionalism was derived by followers of Descartes, wrestling with the mind-body problem. Spinoza dismissed dualism entirely in his theory of monism. Modern critics, such as Jacques Derrida, argue that binary concepts, such as rational, irrational, and civilized savage, reflect only the hierarchical, ethnocentric assumptions they are based on. So again, going back into that sort of more more in terms of the way people sort of condition things or everything like that. So yeah, Gnosticism had it where there's a sort of spiritual realm and these sort of other gods, the Pleroma, and out of that came Sophia, and she kind of wanted to learn about things, but as she sort of fell, in that also created the Demiurge, and the Demiurge is insane, thinks he's the only one true God, and has created everything and has these archons. This is like the short version, has these archons that help him sort of maintain order and control in this sort of diseased matter. But it's, you must love me, I'm the only God, I'm the only thing that there is, there's nothing else, and I demand your love and absolute blank obedience. But one of the reasons that we're able to transcend that is because Sophia, again, descending into matter, we all have that sort of divine spark of that Pleroma and Sophia to help us transcend that. That's short, tiny version of Gnosticism. They also have C-Gnosticism with this as well. I do want to have a side sort of note. This would also, dualism, people will see sort of Taoism as dualistic because of yin and yang. Even the way they talk about this here, the dualism implies polarity and conflict. Yin and yang are not in conflict. Yin and yang are complementary opposites. You can't have one without the other. A height in one begins the growth in the other. Even with the two fish symbol, there's one there. Each side has the other embedded in with it as well. So there you can make a very good case, I believe, to say that therefore, like yin and yang and Taoist sort of stuff is not. Wow, E's have a lot more that I think need to be talked about than I realized. That has a lot more in it that is not technically dualistic. They're complementary. All right, so that is finishing the D's. We are moving along. We're well beyond page 100 now into this thing. And again, there's a bunch of stuff I'm skipping. I'm skipping the people right now. Maybe at some other point in time we'll talk about people in with this. Again, I know there's a lot of these people that are being brought up, and we're not really getting into kind of who they are or anything for the most part. But yeah, we're going to keep going here. We're finished with the D's. Thank you.